Okay, so ready to? Yes. Cool. So next session is analytics informing grassroots campaigning, and we've got Ken STRASMA, Bruce WILLSIE, and SHAUN Roberts today. So we'll start with Ken, who is CEO of Strategic Telemetry and HAYSTAQ DNA. And then we'll move on to Bruce, who is CEO of L2, the leading political data processing and technology firm. And then SHAUN Roberts of the Liberal Democrats, formerly of which the UK Consumer Association. Okay, so over to Ken.
Thank you. I'm not being rude and looking at my cell phone while I do this. I try to be mindful of the time, so I say to myself a stopwatch. So I know, I was telling Bruce, who gets to go second, I hate it when I'm the last person on the panel and the first person just filibusters and it takes almost all the time. And so I'm trying to be very good about that. Okay, so how analytics and micro-targeting informs grassroots campaigns, and also, and I think probably the more interesting part of what I'll try to spend the most of my limited time on, is how it can contribute to polarization and sometimes be misused. So I'm going to blow fairly quickly through the initial how it works. I think in part because people have come to understand micro-targeting fairly well. A few cycles ago, people viewed it as black magic and didn't really believe that you could make accurate predictions about voters. But now people pretty much do understand that and understand the need to target specific voters. We don't, even if we have a message we believe in strongly, we don't want to use a campaign's limited resources talking to everyone. Even in a campaign, with all the money that they could possibly want. I've been fortunate enough to work for Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama, who could raise lots and lots of money, Mike Bloomberg, who raised money by writing himself a check. Even if you have millions and millions of dollars, there are other limited resources, the candidate's time, volunteers' time, and most importantly, the voter's attention span is the most limited resource. So we want to make sure that our limited time and money is spent talking to these people in the middle, the people who are actually persuadable, and that can be found through survey data and through controlled experiments. And then models. We build statistical models that predict how people would have answered these survey questions and whether or not they would move in response to a particular message. Similarly, we find the targets for Get Out the Voter, GOTV, the people who may or may not vote, but if they do, they'll be with our campaign. And of course, in the real world, it looks more like this, it's more cloudy. People don't go around with an A, B, C, or D on their forehead, and that's where predictive analytics comes in. It allows us to make very, very accurate predictions about where in this grid people fall, so we know who we need to talk to. It also allows us to make predictions about their behavior and their attitudes, so that a voter with a limited attention span who's being bombarded not just by the other campaigns, but also by Burger King and McDonald's and Coke and Pepsi and car companies, when we have the 3 seconds in their mailbox or their computer screen, we know that we're engaging with them on an issue that they care about. So all of that can be modeled as well. When we first started doing this, the traditional pattern was that we would engage with the campaign and do candidate-specific large sample surveys and build those models. And we still do that. We'll still do that for a larger campaign. But the technology has improved and the cost of entry for computers and software has gone down enough that we're able to build national models and working with Bruce and his firm L2. You can see this is their software interface here, voter mapping, where you see our national Trump approval score. It's one of about 60 issue scores that we just build ahead of time, update periodically. In fact, I don't even know if I told you, Bruce, we pushed an update today. So this shows Trump approval or disapproval. A blue dot indicates that someone lives at that blue dot who is 74% or more likely to disapprove of Trump. So zooming in on my hometown and then you hit my street, each one of those blue dots represents a house that disapproves of Trump. The few red dots in my very liberal neighborhood approve of him. And the purple dots represent a household where one person approves, one disapproves. It makes it very simple to go down to the individual level and select voters even if you don't have time to build a candidate-specific model. You know in this election cycle, issues about Trump are going to, in the U.S. Midterm elections, are going to be very important. So you've got that as a starting point. We were asked to do a couple examples for recent campaigns of how this was used. One was the Bernie Sanders campaign that I had the honor of working on, where we did an addressable television program. People think about micro-targeting very often in terms of door knocking, direct mail, phones, those things that can be targeted individually. It's increasingly possible to target by television. And in the Michigan primary, we had enough lead time, we were able to do a major addressable television program for Bernie Sanders. And because we actually knew the individuals who received the TV ad, we were able to quantify the effect and found that they were 7% more likely than the people who weren't targeted with those television ads to turn out and vote. And we were able to pay just for the Democratic primary voters who we knew through our modeling would support Sanders if they turned out. So we were able to find a very narrow target audience and actually quantify that we were able to move them. So now to what I think of as more the meat of this question, when data contributes to polarization. If you recall that 9-cell grid that I started out with that showed, with us, with them, in a sort of 50% plus one win scenario. And in US two-party elections, that's often the case. In a parliamentary election, we've got a first past the post system, or in the US in primary systems, it's 50% plus one of the top 2 vote getters. And in the US at least, primary vote is very low. It will tend to be perhaps 10% of the total electorate. So you can end up with a case where someone who gets 5% of the vote decides who's elected in a district. And with more and more gerrymandering, politicians drawing their own lines, you have very safe Democratic or Republican congressional districts who will elect a member of whichever party, and whoever has managed to mobilize that 5 or 10% of the vote to win the primary controls the seat. And unfortunately, those 5 or 10% most likely to vote are going to be the most committed ideological partisans. When data is a hindrance, I think as with any tool, it can be misused, and very often is. People will tend to memorize a formula rather than actually understanding the concepts behind it. I spent a lot of time doing trainings, and I always want to make sure that someone understands the concepts behind targeting much more so than having memorized a formula, because the formulas can be misapplied. And a great example in this past Bernie Sanders campaign, I worked with a lot of people who had come up in politics since micro-targeting became a thing, and they knew some basics, including you turn out in a Democratic for a Democratic candidate, you turn out African American voters for a GOTV. But in the Bernie Sanders campaign, Hillary Clinton was performing much better among African Americans early on in the campaign. So, but unfortunately, we had some people who had learned, okay, this is a part of our playbook. Steps 7 out of 25 is call all the African Americans. And so there were people calling all African Americans who were voting 2-1 for Hillary Clinton on behalf of Bernie Sanders because they just hadn't stopped and thought through the concept, and instead were focusing on the formula that we had learned. The other thing I'd say, another danger in analytics, is when it allows people to ignore what's going on the ground. And that's, I think, one of the biggest lessons that people have learned from Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. I've heard a lot of horror stories about people saying, I was on the ground in Florida or Pennsylvania or Michigan or my home state, Wisconsin, and we saw that this was the problem or that was the problem. Now, I've been on the other end of that equation, where people call me up and say, hey, the models are all wrong because I talked to my Aunt Sally and she's a lifelong Democrat and we only have over 80%. And I'll say, well, 80%, that's a very good prediction, actually, and try to explain that to them. But I think people get into this mindset of we're smarter than them because we've got shiny computers and we know better because we have all these models. And the models say we're fine and we can ignore what's going on in the field. And so I'd always say, no matter how good your models are, hard data, actual conversation with the voter should always trump that model, and always listen to people on the ground, because they're going to know more than I can ever know sitting in my office or my office in Washington, D.C. No matter how much data we have access to, never ignore what's going on the ground. Thank you.
Does anyone have a question at this stage, or move on? Okay, we'll perhaps do questions at the end.
Good afternoon. has had some coffee. My name is Bruce WILLSIE. I'm CEO of L2. We are one of the countries, actually are the countries, the U.S. the largest nonpartisan voter file processing firm in the U.S. And very much enjoyed working with Ken and his firm over the years. If you could switch over to the HDMI cable. Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking today about something very immediate. In fact, as we are meeting today, the voting has already begun in the U.S. There's a special election for a congressional district in the U.S. state of Pennsylvania, a district won by President Trump by 20%, with a 20% margin, and is now open because the current Republican incumbent of the district is resigning under a cloud of scandal. Now, it won't receive a great deal of attention here in London or in any other European capital, but it actually has significant implications for U.S. politics, and the results will be known by tomorrow morning. If you wish to stay up until about 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., you'll probably find out what happened. The candidates, Connor Lamb, a 33-year-old ex-Marine, who is also a former federal prosecutor and a very conservative Democrat, running against Rick Saccone, who is a 60-year-old Republican, current state legislator, and Air Force veteran. Now, he also describes himself as having been Trump before there was a Trump. The implications for this race, everything. The president and his supporters have thrown all they have at this race, hoping to retain the seat and avoid an embarrassing loss in a district that is dominated by the kind of voters who delivered the White House to him. A win by the Democrat, who is also the recipient of a great deal of outside support, would be seen as undermining the president's narrative and encouraging even more Democratic candidates to challenge Republican incumbents next November, when control of the U.S. House of Representatives, our lower chamber, could switch from Republican to Democrat. At the core of this campaign, data, and lots of it. While access to enhanced voter data here in the UK is not a problem, our colleagues from other European countries face more of a challenge, and the looming GDPR regulations may affect many campaigns. So how are we different in the US? Put it in a nutshell, or to use cowboy terms, it's the Wild West. Few restrictions apply to the use of widely available registered voter data in campaigns, and a wealth of commercial data and sophisticated analytics on top of it to enhance it, make for a very different campaigning environment. So let me give you a very quick tour here. This is, through the internet, we're looking at a view of all registered voters in the US. The dots are colored red for Republican, blue for Democrat. So in the US, we're about 185 million voters strong, but we're a divided country. First, we're divided geographically. As you can see, if you draw a straight line down through the center of the country, everything to the right of that line, to the east of it, constitutes about 80% of US voters in the country. But we're divided politically as well. Not a surprise. If we look at the political party split in the US, you'll see that approximately 39% are registered Democrats, about 32% are Republicans, and the remaining nonpartisan and minor parties. Now, the data available to US campaigns is rich and is up to date, and patterns of data can now be visualized across the country. They can also be viewed for a single voter. So if we were to zoom in here, urban area, we can be looking at a single voter's home. And the voters within that home. Again, we're coloring the dots here on the basis of party affiliation, and of course get all of this kind of demographic information about each voter. So that's things like likely income, likely level of education, all of the elections in which the individual has voted, net worth, the kinds of, from commercial data, the kinds of magazines they read, the interests they have, the contributions they make. So it's a tremendous amount of information. With modeling applied to these databases, new geographic and demographic patterns emerged, which brings us back to the US midterm elections. I'm going to zoom back out here. And what we want to look at is this distribution, again, of Democrats and Republicans across the country. So nationally, about the Democrats, registered Democrats, have about a 7 percentage point advantage over Republicans. However, and I won't do this to save time, but if I were to select just those voters who voted in the last US presidential election, that advantage among the voters who actually turn out drops down to about 3%. So 7% Democratic advantage down to a 3% Democratic advantage. If you then select just the voters who voted in the midterm elections, which are our federal congressional elections, along with local elections, the advantage switches to the Republican Party that has about a 3% advantage over Democrats. So clearly, in the midterm elections, Democrats have a turnout problem. It is a problem even in general elections, but it is truly amplified during the midterm elections. A recent analysis published by the New York Times, you may have seen the article, kind of a misleading title, but it's the Missing Obama Millions. It sounds like it's an article about a financial heist. It's actually not. It showed that the millions of 2012 Obama voters who did not vote in 2016 held views that were very similar to those who voted for Clinton, but they stayed home. So who were those voters? Well, we can select them fairly quickly here and take a look at them. So if we select all Democrats, about 72 million across the United States, and revisualize them, and then require that they have voted in the 2012 election, but did not vote in the 2016 general, after it resolves here, we will be left with about, it's about 5.791 million voters. Now, the interesting thing to notice here is where they are located. They are mostly in urban areas, and if I were to open the side panels here, you'd see that about 50% of them are under the age of 40, are minority, and are of lower income. So they live in these urban areas, and if we zoom in and look particularly at the upper Midwest US states, where the president won in the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, again, you are looking here at all of these voters who stayed at home, but were likely to have views that would have support, actually about most of these were likely to have views that supported Hillary Clinton. You can see that they would have possibly changed the outcome of the election. All right, well now let's switch back to looking at specifically at this race in Pennsylvania in CD 18. This is a very interesting race in that the district has a slight majority. The district is here in the southwestern corner of the state. It has, in fact, a slight majority of of Democrats, and yet it is a district that President Trump won again by 20 percentage points, which is huge. So the district, even though it seemingly puts Republicans at a disadvantage, and in the past when the labor unions were strong in this area, did put Republicans at a disadvantage, many things have changed. The decline of the steel industry, which is located in this part of the state near Pittsburgh, has overwhelmingly changed the district. It is now this district, which is overwhelmingly white and middle class. We could look at the numbers in here for it. It's an area where economic anxiety is hit hard, along with the decline in manufacturing jobs. It's an area of average income, and socially it's more conservative. The changes in the district resulted in 2016 with that 20% winning margin for President Trump. In order to get that, obviously, a very significant percentage of registered Democrats had to cross the aisle and vote for the president. Now, to take that Republican-held seat in this congressional race that's taking place right now, the Democrats would need a candidate that fit the district. And bottom line is that there is no opportunity to find the types of voters who did not vote in the 2016 presidential election in this district. They just don't exist. So the data analysis led to an interesting strategy by both sides. Lamb has cultivated a common sense conservative image, attempting to appeal to the conservative and disaffected Democrats in the district. And on behalf of SHAUN, outside groups have simultaneously been targeting liberal Democrats, repeating the campaign lines from the Lamb campaign, liberal Democrats, repeating those conservative themes of the Lamb campaign and trying to lower enthusiasm for voting for Lamb among those groups. Demographic data and issue analysis, along with modeling subsets of voters, is driving both campaigns. And the polls have been done, and here in London we'll know the outcome by early tomorrow morning. The polls have been very close. So does the heavy use of data for targeting and analysis drive polarization? I would suggest actually that, at least in this specific case of PACD 18, it may suggest otherwise, at least in certain cases. When both candidates fit the demographics of the district, there's less room to emphasize the ideological division between Democrats and Republicans, and efforts are shifted to trying to divide your opponent's party based on the ideological. In other words, if driving an even deeper wedge between Republicans and Democrats is not useful, then the much more difficult attempt is made to divide subgroups within a single party and depress core support for your opponent. It's not a new strategy. Of course, it's been used for a long time, but the consequences of such a strategy may actually be to build support among those other subgroups within your opponent's party, and more importantly, may even strengthen support across party lines, actually reducing polarization. And we'll have to wait and see whether that technique on the part of the Republican campaign was successful. Can data be a hindrance to a campaign? On this, I absolutely agree with Ken. Yes, it can. When data obsession drives out larger campaign themes and micro-targeting drives candidates to focus on narrower and narrower segments of the voting population. I think a good counterexample of this is actually President Trump. I think that while his campaign certainly did perform data analysis, it was the broader themes enunciated by the candidate on a daily basis, I think we're all aware, that drove the news cycle and probably had a greater effect in shaping the views of the electorate. Finally, can data collected on the ground be fed back into the overall data analytics quickly enough to be useful? Well, again, yes. Technology is now making this possible. During the last Obama campaigns, data collected on a daily and even hourly basis from literally tens of thousands of people with handheld devices in the field was fed back into sophisticated models, and thousands of simulations of the election were run every single night. Spoiler alert, appearing in the future, and I think that you will see this as a new trend, will be a partnering between data modeling and polling firms, data modeling and polling firms that will automate the techniques that were used in the Obama campaign, making them available to all candidates as customized applications for tens of thousands of dollars rather than millions. Thank you.
So, I'm Sean Roberts. I'm Director of Campaigns and Elections at the Liberal Democrats. A little bit about me is that I spent the first 15 years of my campaigning life as a volunteer. So I come from the grassroots. In the second half of my campaign life, I've been working in party HQs, charity HQs, so I've really come from both sides of it a bit. And I think if there's one thing from that experience, is the most important thing almost around this, is around relationships. Because if you actually want to get the most out of data, then the relationship between pretty much where a lot of that data comes from, maybe the HQ, and the grassroots has to be strong and has to be good. A quick bit about my party is that we had some very successful years. We entered government in 2010. That didn't go so well. The coalition pretty much wiped out in 2015. And since then, it's been about rebuild. And at the heart of that rebuild, and the reason that we were completely wiped out, essentially, is the grassroots. And in a country where there's no TV advertising for politics, no radio advertising for politics, so much of our campaigning is really generated around, is around our grassroots. And in fact, a lot of the resources that exist in a smaller party like ours are actually at grassroots level rather than in party HQ. So anything that improves the way that how we deliver most of our campaign at the grassroots is a massive, massive bonus. And I still think back to the guy who taught me 30 odd years ago, who sort of, as part of it, used to jokingly say, half our campaign is wasted. The problem is I don't know which half. And I think today, thanks to the improvements we've made through these years, we're a lot better at knowing which half is the best bit, and probably have eliminated a lot of the things we might have used to have done. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the positives and some of the negatives around how data and analytics has changed and improved, I think, our grassroots campaign. Firstly, validating the good stuff, that thing I said about what really works. So our general election last year, well, we were up against a very, very tough situation because British politics has polarised post-Brexit. So, normally the top two parties have been getting about 65% of the vote. Last year that rose to 82% of the vote. If you're not one of those two parties, last year was really tough. We actually managed to grow last year in the face of that. And big part of that was really about making the most use of those analytics and looking at our results at the end of it. We could absolutely see that one of the biggest drivers of our vote was doorstep contacts. The second biggest driver was the size of the membership in the area, which clearly is very much related to those doorstep contacts. And we can now take that information and actually really work with the grassroots to really say, this is what matters. These are the things you need to focus on. So they actually start making more of a priority for those kind of things. So about reinforcing good habits and trying to kill off some of the bad habits, that has been a really big difference, and evidence and data really drives that. The second thing is about focusing on the most important voters. I think we've already sort of talked about how we can really sort of drive at the voters that make a difference. So one of the ways that my party grows is through by-elections and special elections. So 2 years ago we had a by-election at a place called Richmond Park, coming from a very, very long way behind, but through the data and analytics, we didn't start from scratch. We knew who's going to vote, who's most likely to vote. We've been gathering petitions in the area through the years. We knew where people stood on the big issues. Our modelling showed where pretty much the pro-European voters were. And all this sets us off and running at a much higher speed than ever would have been the case before. I think the third thing of where it really makes a difference is around me as the HQ person and having that centralised control of resources and being able to see what's happening on the ground in every one of our seats. So in our general election last year, as I say, with the other two parties effectively rising both about 10% in votes, we had to be really fast moving and very careful about how you use limited resources. And the thing I'd probably say about that is we didn't rely on one set of data for that. And I think one of the things that's been mentioned quite a few times now is about the sort of feedback loop potentially from the grassroots. Data, sometimes the canvas data, not the best guide. So really trying to mix up that feedback, what we're seeing from social media, what we're seeing from polls, to really decide that resource allocation. So using lots of different bits of data to get a really firm grasp of things, I think makes a big difference. Risks, I think, of things that probably where it's not so good. Retreating into a bubble is, I think, very much the number one thing for this for me. Particularly grassroots campaigning, it builds relationships. It builds relationships very often out beyond our traditional party support. A lot of my party's MPs have been MPs for quite some time. The ones that are there, and a lot of the new ones have built up this very strong personal profiles that actually allows them to break out beyond the modelling into sort of communities that might not otherwise vote for them because of the way they campaign. And sometimes if we're very much too focused on what the model says and what groups of people, and we keep talking to those perhaps just the swing voters, we lose touch with some of those bits outside. And I think that can be a really, really big risk. I think the next bit is around another risk is kind of the new generations that are very, very used to data and kind of have a great deal of trust in data, which on one level I love. But I still remember showing training some of our young activists, probably about 10, 15 years ago, on how to use our very basic database system, the first database system our party had. And they would run a count to see how many, say, supporters we had in this area. It would come back and say 10,000. And I'd say, run it again. And I said, why? And I said, just run it again. It would come, run it again, it would say 12,000. And they'd go, now run it the third time. And it would be the 12,000. You've got two in a row, that's going to be the number. But today, I think there's almost a little bit of a sat-nav kind of nature to it. If it tells you to turn right, you turn right, regardless of what you see to the right. And we certainly had a by-election about 18 months ago where something went wrong with the data, which completely blew away our turnout figures. We didn't know that at the time. We were looking at an election where we were expecting a pretty high turnout, and it just looked like no one was coming out. And we spent pretty much hours thinking, oh my God, we're going to lose this thing because we need the votes to be out in the day. And it was really telling that actually people didn't react in that same way. It doesn't look visually right, it doesn't fit with everything we picked up from this campaign, and finally we actually went out to a polling station and managed to sort of persuade someone to tell us how many people had voted, and lo and behold it was right. But there's sometimes that little bit too much trust that we've always got to be slightly aware of. And the final thing is around people change, and I think we've seen that particularly in the UK in the last 2 years. But a model that worked in 2015, in 2017 is almost partly completely thrown out. So the first by-election that we did post-Brexit, we're out there, we're campaigning, we're working up a really strict list of what's supposed to be the swing voters, the voters open to us, and then one, quite early on, fortunately, some of our people just went off list and started knocking on random doors and found they were getting at least a good response on the wider list. And it was that, again, this is the kind of voter feedback, also the feedback from the grassroots that makes a really, really big difference and enables us to sort of be flexible and move with it and being really, really sort of making the most of that kind of information. And I think one of the things about the British general election last year is both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, in fact, no one was expecting it. In fact, the Conservative Party didn't tell their own kind of campaign team it was coming. The models were out of date, and the stories in that campaign around Conservatives turning up at certain doorsteps, being sent to certain areas to talk to voters that they were certain were going to be theirs, it was immense. And the breakdown in trust, to bring it back to that relationship, if HQ is telling you, go and talk to these voters, and they're not right, that damage can be absolutely critical. I think that's very much something that can go wrong with this. So what does it mean going forward? Well, first, one of the best words I like to use about this is curious. We should always be curious with our data, we should keep searching out more, we should keep finding new and better ways to track things. We should be a teeny bit cautious, absolutely be aware of the changing situations, be willing to learn from the mistakes, but the last thing and most important thing, be open with the grassroots, engage with them and work to build that trust, because sometimes that can be the biggest difference in making sure that the data and analytics we have is used effectively. Thank you.
Okay, have we got any questions from the floor?
Hi, I'm Bob Penner from Canada, and I also work here in the UK. So each of you, I think, referred to some examples of where predictive modeling has been inaccurate or a problem in campaigns. Certainly the campaign was well known that the analytics seem to be wrong. Sean mentioned that. So the thing about analytics is they're predicting, using all the data points you have, how somebody will vote today based on the information you have today. So what are the developments in predictive analytics that are actually predicting change in behavior based on changing circumstances? There's one thing to say that we should have more real-time feedback and we'll keep updating our models based on how things are changing. But what about the predictions about how things might change based on various circumstances? like we would do in polling, where you'd simulate the campaign dynamics by going, what if you had this message, and what if you had that message, and what if we did this A/B test? So we're simulating what would go on in the real world of campaigning. So what about in the world of analytics? Are you guys, do you have things that are doing that? Is that on the horizon, or is it in place now that I'm not aware of?
So two things to address that. Bruce alluded to the fact that modeling is just getting much quicker. So when I was doing the Obama campaign in 2008, we were very proud of the fact that we were updating our models weekly, and up through the Sunday before the election. And unfortunately, the models were right, because someone asked me, what do you do if Sunday before the election it shows the models were wrong? And someone else said, well, panic, but we didn't have to do that. So now nightly it's much more common, and we've had proof of concept for a 10 million voter state where we can have sub-second updates to micro-targeted models. So someone with a mobile device knocks on a door, enters information, and pretty much the time it takes them to refresh their phone screen, the models have been updated. So that's on the purely technical plumbing end. This real-time micro-targeting is now possible just because the software and computers are so much faster than they used to be. Then in terms of being smarter about thinking about this, part of the problem with models is that people don't engage in elections that early. With most people, if you ask them early on, they haven't made up their mind because they're just not thinking about it. And so we've had great success with some modeling where we ask people a series of issue questions or personality type questions, where we're able to model like who is likely to come over to a particular candidate once they engage and once they make up their mind. And we first did this with Barack Obama again, where we were able to find the people who hadn't started to think about it, but asking questions about some hot-button issues like abortion and guns, and some less intuitive questions. We were able to predict almost as accurately as we were for the people who answered the survey questions how these people who were telling us they were undecided would eventually break out. So like we like to say that we knew who they were going to vote for before they knew. Obviously, like I said, our data should trump those models. Like if they tell you to change your mind, but you can often come at it sideways from some personality or issue type questions to predict who is likely to move in a particular direction. And if your persuasion models are based on controlled experiments where you're actually testing who's moved in response to particular types of messages and particular issues, then you can game out, okay, so imagine we've run this number of gross ratings points of this TV ad, how do we think these particular voters will have moved?
Okay, is there any other questions?
Yeah. So this is a question I've asked in a lot of panels like this. The sample size matters. How well does this scale down to a PA18 or even smaller than that, a municipal election? How well do any analytic predictive models scale smaller than a presidential?
So we found a sort of plateau around 7,500. Like I prefer to have 10,000 or more surveys. At below 7,500, you're unable to do some of the things statistically with the machine learning algorithms that you can do lower. So if you're talking about a city council race that has 5,000 voters, obviously you're not going to survey 7,500. But what you can do, I mentioned the issue models that we have. So perhaps you can't survey this city council race with a few thousand people about the specific named candidates, but you can have a larger area where you've asked, do you think you should spend more on schools? Are you happy with municipal services, garbage collection? How do you feel about Donald Trump? Like all those other things. And then you're able to take a smaller survey, 100 or 200 people in that small district, and say, okay, here's how these responses correlate with these other larger models you have. So while the really advanced artificial intelligence modeling techniques rely on Google and Facebook scale levels of data, you can then take it and look at the correlations with much smaller sample sizes in order to get something that's different but still quite usable.
What level of confidence?
So just as with the poll, we can calculate the margin of error for those, and that's something we always do before telling the client to use something.
Any more questions on the call? Okay. We'll wrap up. Okay, thank you very much to
I will ask our next panelist to come to the stage, and we will move into a discussion around polling. I wanted to make a couple announcements for the logistics of the dinner cruise. There's still time to get a dinner cruise ticket if you haven't booked yet. So you have two options. One is that at 7 o'clock you can meet us in front of the Marriott Hotel. This is the building right around the corner, so not back at the lobby, not by the fake dandelions, as it turns out, but in the street. So you can meet us at 7 o'clock there, or you can meet at the pier, and there is a directions in your booklet. So 7:15. And on the back side of the ticket, there's a specific map. So the boat will not wait, I am told. So be on time.
So thank you, Christina. Let's come to the last session of the day. I think it was a long day and we had very interesting speeches and sessions. So thank you to Capital and the whole team to do this fantastic job for EAPC. Let's introduce our next speakers to the topic politics in the age of polarization, and we have really two very experienced experts with us, and it's an honor for me as a board member of EAPC and also as the founder to introduce you, these both very experienced experts. I want to start with Mark Millman. Mark is the president of the American Association of Political Consultants, and he is also the head of the Millman Group, one of the leading American public opinion and research companies, and one of the most awarded research firms in the US. So he is very experienced, and he did more than 500 campaigns, national and international. So he knows the whole story. And it's also a big honor for me to introduce Professor John Curtis. John Curtis is Professor of Politics at the Strathclyde University of Glasgow, Scotland, and he is Senior Research Fellow at the Netsin Social Research, Britain's largest independent research institute. So there are two experienced people with us, and we will have very interesting speeches during the next half an hour. So let's start with Mr. Curtis.
Thank you very much. Could somebody tell me how the technology works, please, because I've got slides.
It's okay.
Right, how do I get the slide? Ah, there's a little box. Ah, right. Ah, wonderful. Right, okay. This is aimed primarily at those of you who come from outside the UK, so apologies to those of you who are very familiar, maybe in your view horribly familiar with the debate about Brexit in this country. But as the theme of this session is about polarisation, and given that as I'm going to try to